Morning. Thank you. I grew up with nature in my backyard and I developed quite a strong interest in biological systems, something which my parents nurtured in me from a very young age. And so when I went off to university, that's what I went and studied, was biological systems, and that kind of took me down this pathway into biochemistry. And then from there, that took me into a field of nutritional and metabolic biochem, and eventually into dietetics. So after I finished a whole bunch of study, I went and worked as a clinical dietitian in the healthcare system. And once I arrived there, I realised that I was working in a system that was spending billions of dollars on people who were very unwell with largely avoidable problems. Avoidable problems through their diets, through lack of exercise, smoking and those kinds of things. So here I was, after 5 or 6 years of study, working in a hospital, thinking, what do I do next? I'm not going to spend the rest of my career here. I'm at the wrong end of the system. And so I went from there and started to think about, well, what's happening with our health and with food. And one of the things that really struck me was that we have about 1 billion people who are severely overweight and obese around the world, and we have another about 1 billion people who are underfed and seriously undernourished. It's what Raj Patel calls the great divide between the stuffed and starved. So we've got this enormous issue. And whilst I was thinking about those questions, I realised there are a whole lot of other big issues in the food system. Things like, outside the modern world of agricultural markets, we have about 1 billion small plot farmers in developing countries who are doing it quite tough each year. And every year, 50 million farmers end up in slums. 50 million farmers every year end up in slums. So the world slum population is due to grow from about 1 billion to 2 billion in the next sort of 10 to 15 years. That's a really big global issue we've got coming around the corner at us. We've also created a food system where it is easier and actually cheaper for consumers to eat highly processed, fatty, fast foods, particularly in these food deserts that have been talked about recently. It's easier and cheaper for them to go and buy fast food for dinner each night than it is to buy fresh produce. So we've got a food system at the moment which is seriously designed to cause big health issues. In the last 50 years, we've lost topsoil from the area the size of India and China combined. So I wonder what the next 50 years will bring. Over 70% of the world's fisheries are at the point of collapse from overfishing. The world's fresh water supplies above the ground and below are disappearing faster than natural cycles are replacing them. We've had a little bit about, from Dudley this morning, the management of aquifers. That's actually quite rare around the world, and the largest aquifers are depleting faster than we know what to do about them. The amount of arable land for farming has basically peaked unless we rip down more forests around the world, and that's coming at a time when the world's population is growing from about 7 billion to 9.2 billion as it's estimated. We're also, on top of all of this, converting land use from food to biofuels what I think is a very poor attempt to deal with another big problem called climate change. And on top of that, of course, we've become quite addicted to monocultures. And they require big doses of fertiliser and pesticide that's harming our health, our land, and now they're also changing the acidity of the ocean. So after thinking about all of this, I'm going to cut a very long story short, I decided I need to go and work in the multinational food manufacturing space to find out what the hell is going on. And once I got there, I found that on all sides of the sector, across the sectors, from NGOs, the big private business, the multinational corporations, and also governments and around the world, that when on a day-to-day basis, a lot of these people aren't really thinking about farmer poverty, about consumer health, and about the health of ecosystems. And I sat in many, many meetings where it was about whether it was about strategy, product development, marketing, packaging, or selling, it was about how can we sell more of this stuff. Whether it's to grow our GDP, our national GDP, or whether it's to grow profits in the private sector. And you know, I find a lot of compassion for all these stakeholders in this global food system, because unlike myself, where I have a very big family who have been farming for about 150 years just south of here, a lot of the people who I was working with, they grew up in cities, they studied in cities, and they work in cities, big cities around the world. And so there is no connection with the land, there's no connection with nature, and very little connection with very different types of communities around the world. So it's not in their consciousness. So for me, this is a very big, this systemic blindness is a very big problem, and something we've been hearing a lot about this morning. So I think it's no wonder that we find it very difficult to bring people together, because a lot of people don't perceive that there's a big problem, and when we do bring them together occasionally, it's very hard to understand each other because we see the system from such different perspectives. So therefore, similarly to Thomas Homer Dixon, a new big question emerged in my life, which sits with me almost every day still. How do we create the conditions for diverse groups of stakeholders who have fundamentally different points of view and interests at stake to transcend those differences and co-create profoundly innovative solutions to tough systemic issues affecting the food system? So that possibility is what we're going to focus on over the next 10 minutes. I want to introduce you to a whole new breed of cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural and cross-sector innovation processes that I think have the potential to bring people together, unlock these stuck patterns of interactions that we see when we bring them together, create fresh ways of seeing the world, uncover the kind of collective will that we clearly require to address the much deeper systemic causes behind our most difficult problems in the food, water and energy systems, which seem to be highly interrelated. There's a network of leaders who have been doing this kind of work around the world, these very transformational cross-sector innovation platforms, and three of those who I really want to acknowledge now because this is where a lot of the work has come from. Two of them are Drs. Otto Sharma and Peter Senge from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and who are also founders of the Presencing Institute, which I had the opportunity to be involved in about 5 or 6 years ago. And also really like to acknowledge another person, Hal Hamilton, who is one of the founders and also the CEO of the Sustainable Food Lab, which is based in the US and operates all across the Americas and Europe, and also a little bit in some other regions as well, but the focus are the Americas and Europe. Now, I'm not going to go into too much depth or even any depth around the projects and outcomes from those initiatives, because there's a lot of information available on the internet and you can easily go and get all of that stuff. What I really want to focus on now is the underlying process and principles that we're using for bringing all of these people together that's leading such a transformation in the way that they're seeing each other and the world around them, which is allowing them, developing the collective will to innovate in profound ways across really large food systems. So firstly, this new breed of cross-sector innovation processes use what we call a whole systems approach, a little bit of what we've touched on this morning. These change processes need to mirror the full complexity of stakeholders in the system, where all stakeholders are equal partners, from decision makers and institutions right through to those who are most marginalised. I think Fiona was just touching on that just then. So in our view, that whole systems change can't be accomplished without by leaving out the needs, wisdom and influence of some stakeholders. If we do that, we'll continue ending up with very fragmented, incremental and ineffective solutions to these tough problems. Secondly, this emerging breed of cross-sector innovation processes also use a participative approach. So bringing all these stakeholders together is great, but it's not enough. How we bring them together and how they engage with each other while they're together in the room is vital. But of course we don't like doing that very often because we usually get stuck in patterns of talking nice, talking tough and not talking at all. So it's something that governments largely avoid. Again, something we've just heard Fiona talk about. And when we get stuck in these tough patterns of talking nice, talking tough, talking not or not talking at all, it often reinforces old paradigms that we have about each other and further deepens our cynicism and deteriorates into stalemates or fragmented solutions. I don't think it needs to be like this, and personally this has been a big part of my work, which is designing and also facilitating these kinds of forums. We can often change these patterns of thinking, listening and talking by building awareness of them when we bring groups together. So there's lots of ways we do that, but one of the frameworks that we find very helpful is this one here, which was actually developed by Otto Sharma over at MIT. So typically we find stakeholder groups get stuck in those what we call field 1 and field 2 of listening and talking. It's what you'll see up there in terms of downloading and debating. But by bringing awareness about those fields of talking and listening, when we see it evolve in the room, what we find is that stakeholders generate a whole new awareness about the ways that they're often contributing to the stuck patterns of conversation, and usually it's quite transformational. They begin to want to move away from that, and they develop a whole new desire to move into that third field up there, that much more dialogic space. So when we bring these stakeholders together, we do a lot of work with them real time, pointing out the patterns of listening and talking that are shutting down meaning and shared understanding and keeping them away from usually the things that matter most to them. Thirdly, this new breed of cross-sector innovation processes also use what we call a generative approach. So to date around the world, leadership and change have basically, approaches to leadership and change have basically been based on this approach up here, which is learning from experiences of the past, or what we also call reactive learning or action learning. However, as we all know, today's leaders have been facing challenges that are unfolding in unfamiliar and often unpredictable ways. So restricting our learning only to what we know from past experiencing is limiting and ineffective. So we need to learn to let go of paradigms that we've acquired through past experiences. We need to learn to see the world with a beginner's mind. We need to learn to see new possibilities that are unlimited by what we think we know from the past, and get very connected, deeply connected, I think, to the whole system of life in which we participate. Like so many Indigenous cultures have before us, we need to deeply respect the balance of life on Earth, and even find what Joel Salatin calls the sacredness in everything, the sacredness in eggs and the sacredness in chickenness, which he talks about in one of his TEDx talks. So there are many names, I think, for this personal journey of learning and even spiritual growth, and we've called it generative learning because it's about generating a very different sense of life, or balance of life on Earth, that increases biodiversity rather than rapidly destroying it. And yet this concept of generative learning, as powerful it is a very big blind spot inside organisations. We don't engage in learning experiences or conversations or places for groups of people to grow and understand the world around them with this kind of generative learning. So whilst it's a massive blind spot, I think it's also an enormous opportunity for fundamentally rethinking how we do change, learning, leadership and innovation inside organisations, but also between organisations. So the folk at MIT and the Presencing Institute have been focusing on these approaches to cross-sector innovation, thinking about, well, how do we go about designing that? When we bring people together, what does all of this mean at a practical level? They've been doing that for about 15, 20 years now, and certainly over the last 7 years we have seen some extraordinary cross-sector innovations occur through those initiatives as this approach matures. I think quite importantly what we've found is that these whole systems, participative and generative approaches require, that first of all that they're possible. They're very unfamiliar and unusual looking journeys, but they're possible, but they require a really substantial journey. So it's not a journey that everyone wants to go on just yet, but I think over the last 7 years we're seeing a shift in the collective consciousness of very senior stakeholders around the world, senior stakeholders in government and business and NGOs who are beginning to see the world very differently, are trying to find each other, and these platforms that we're creating are a vehicle for them to find each other and go on a very different journey. So the Sustainable Food Lab is one of those, and a number of other initiatives in the Presencing Institute represent that as well. So I very quickly want to look at these 5 stages of the journey. And I'm not going to go into too much depth about this. If you want to have a look at a lot more depth around this process and the journey, presencing.com or the sustainablefoodlab.org, you'll find a lot more detail. And basically there are 5 stages here, what we call co-initiating, co-sensing, presencing, co-creating and co-evolving. This is also known now as Theory U. There's a book that's been written about that by Otto. There are a number of papers. It's also sometimes called the Presencing Approach or the U process. Certainly by a lot of the execs who are involved in this, they nickname it the U process. So let me just quickly talk about the co-initiating phase, because that's probably the most difficult in my experience over the last 7 years. That's about finding stakeholders across these sectors who actually want to come together and get on this substantial journey. Now, in the Sustainable Food Lab, that started by a small group of about 4 people who decided to go and interview stakeholders across whole food supply chains, from farm to fork in different communities and countries. And over time, these stakeholders and others and dozens of communities across several countries became quite deeply inspired about the idea of coming together like this, and they formed a 2-year cross-sector innovation journey, which is now called the Sustainable Food Lab. And over the last 5 or 6 years, they have moved on to prototyping very innovative small-scale prototypes of the future food system to very large-scale systemic change. So the co-sensing stage, very briefly, that's about starting the journey now. Once we've got these stakeholders coming together and committing to the journey, it's about bringing them to get together. You can imagine when they arrive together, they've got very different perspectives of the system. So one of the big things we do here is we take them on learning journeys. We take them on learning journeys, which is out into the field from one end of the food system to the other end of the food system together, quite large groups. It could be 100, 200 or 300. And these learning journeys typically last for about a week. They're very well facilitated. There's a lot of unpacking of the experiences that these stakeholders are having together and how they're seeing different bits of the food system similarly but also differently, and what that means together. We can have many of these learning journeys before we move into the next stage. So we need to be quite adaptive here. It's hard to pre-design this whole journey until we begin to see the shifts in perspective occur along the way. So that's the co-sensing stage in a nutshell. The presencing stage here, the third stage, that's about building in some deep personal reflection processes, which we can do on our own, and we can also do with executive coaches and wise elders in the community. There are all sorts of things that we do. Some groups also choose to go on vision quests out into nature. We've seen people, executives, global executives, from the Sustainable Food Lab go onto these vision quests out into nature, and that facilitates, I think, it's very hard to describe that experience, but to boil it down, I think what I've personally seen happen in those experiences, people who have not grown up with nature around them, they have profound insights into into the conditions of their inner nature, and how that's reflected to what we're doing in nature around the world. So it's quite a transformational experience, and it changes fundamentally their sense of purpose in life. Now, when we come back and we debrief these groups who have been out on these kinds of journeys and done this kind of reflection, a shared purpose emerges between them, which is deeply connected to each other and the world around them. And that is really, really different to where these groups start. When they rock up, they're from different sectors, different organisations with a lot at stake, seeing the world really differently. They cannot find shared purpose. They cannot not find a shared vision. They're thinking incrementally. They're thinking in terms of linear systems. When they get to this part of the journey, that substantially changes. And it's only there that we really move into the innovation space, which is this next stage here, co-creating. So you can imagine when we get people into an innovation space now, not at the beginning of the journey, but at this point of the journey, their sense of connection and purpose is fundamentally different. So the kind of innovation now that we're talking about are 3 or 4 day workshops. Over these 3 or 4 day workshops, stakeholders who have a lot at stake get to explore what's possible between them in a low-risk environment, so they can take unusual risks together. It's very iterative. We have them look at new policies, engagement processes, business models, supply chain practices, change journeys, and they go through that many times until over several days they begin to feel like they've got a vision and a prototype of the future food system that they could actually pull off together. And from there, we move them out into the field, and over 6-12 months they begin to put these prototypes into practice, and as those prototypes begin to generate the desired results, we then often have to scale them up. And so this is the last phase. When we get around to scaling them up, there are a couple of different ways of doing that. On the one hand, sometimes it's about replication, but more often than not, it's about using the new paradigms and relationships across the sectors and the new kinds of business models and leadership behaviours that are going to enable them to scale up across communities, from one community to dozens, or one supply chain to many supply chains, so that we can see quite large-scale systemic change. So finally, I think that whilst the Sustainable Food Lab is a really good example of these kinds of transformational cross-sector innovation programs, so is the Presencing Institute. I deeply believe that government, NGOs and businesses could be investing a lot more in these kinds of platforms. We're seeing almost nothing like this in Australia or even in Asia. It's quite early stage. They take a while to mature. We've only got one planet, and so I think that we need to start very, very soon. That's all for me. Thanks for your generous listening.